Black CEO humiliated by white female CEO at Billionaire Gala. Minutes later, $4.9 billion vanished. Hello everyone, before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. A farm girl at our gala? The words detonated across the ballroom loud, sharp, meant to cut. Laughter followed immediately, the kind that arrives already rehearsed. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, scattering light across white linens and silver cutlery. Champagne flutes trembled as guests leaned in, hungry for the spectacle. At the center table sat the woman they were laughing at. She wore a simple, elegant dress in a warm, burnt orange hue, tailored, unshowy, confident without asking permission. Her posture was straight. Her hands were folded. Her face gave nothing away. Hair swept into a high, sculpted bun, she looked composed in a room that had decided she was entertainment. Across from her, the white female CEO in a fitted red gown leaned forward, arm extended, finger pointed like a verdict. Her smile was wide and triumphant. The joke had landed. She knew it. She basked in the sound of approval around her, bankers in tuxedos, investors with old money faces, wives laughing a beat too loudly. Someone clinked a glass. Another raised a phone. Seriously, the woman in red continued, her voice buoyant with mockery, who let her in? Did the staff entrance get confused? The table erupted. Chairs scraped. A man in a navy tux wiped tears of laughter from his eyes. Another guest shook his head in disbelief, already filming. The phones came up in unison, sleek and black, predators drawn to blood. The woman in orange didn't move. She let the laughter wash over her, felt it bounce off the stillness she had perfected long ago. She had learned, early, that reacting too quickly gave people what they wanted. That silence, real silence, made them uncomfortable. So she stayed still. She breathed. She watched. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Ariana Cole. Ariana's eyes lifted, calm and deliberate, taking in the scene like a surveyor mapping land. The towering floral arrangements. The orchestra paused mid-phrase. The blue glow of the walls that made everything look colder than it was. She noticed the way laughter softened when it reached her, like it didn't quite know where to land. The woman in red leaned back, pleased. Relax, she said, waving a dismissive hand. It's a joke. Don't be so sensitive. We're all friends here. She tilted her head, studying Ariana with open curiosity. You're, what, a guest of a guest? Ariana met her gaze. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, she said. Her voice was quiet. Level. It didn't rise to meet the room. That, somehow, made it louder. A few smiles faltered. Someone coughed. A man down the table glanced at the place cards, then at Ariana again, uncertain. The woman in red laughed it off, turning to the others. See? Confidence. I like that. She lifted her glass. But let's be honest, this section is for major donors. Ariana nodded once, a small acknowledgement. She could feel the room deciding what she was. She could hear the assumptions assembling themselves, how she spoke, how she dressed, how she didn't play alone. The label had already been chosen. It always was. She looked down at the table. At the immaculate white cloth. At the gold-rimmed plates that cost more than most people's rent. Then she glanced at her phone resting beside her place setting. Face down. Silent. Waiting. The woman in red leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to make it intimate, just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Tell me," she said, smiling thinly, "do you even know what kind of money is sitting at this table?" Ariana's fingers brushed the edge of her phone. Around them, laughter swelled again, less confident this time, like a crowd sensing a shift but not understanding it yet. The orchestra resumed, tentative. Glasses clinked. The moment stretched. Ariana looked up. Her expression hadn't changed. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Something colder. Something precise. "Yes," she said. "I do." She placed her hand flat on the table, steadying the china. Then, with a movement so small it almost went unnoticed, she turned her phone over. The screen lit briefly before dimming again. Across the table, the woman in red was still smiling. She had no idea the joke had already ended. The laughter didn't stop right away. It lingered, bounced from glass to glass, fed on itself. That was how rooms like this worked. Sound became permission. And permission became cruelty dressed up as charm. Ariana Cole remained seated. From the outside, it looked like compliance. Like endurance. Like she was absorbing the insult because she had no other option. That was the mistake everyone at the table made at the same time. The woman in red, Margot Hale, relaxed into her chair, satisfied. She crossed one leg over the other, enjoying the small aftershock of attention. This was her terrain: donors, cameras, controlled laughter. Power, to her, was volume. Power was being seen and affirmed. She leaned toward the man on her right, not bothering to lower her voice. "You can always tell," she said lightly. "They try so hard to look comfortable." More laughter. Softer now. Thinner. Ariana heard it all. The comments that weren't meant for her ears but landed there anyway. She had heard versions of them in boardrooms, at conferences, in offices with frosted glass and closed doors. The setting changed. The assumption didn't. She studied Margot the way one studies a familiar equation, variables already known. The confidence that came from inherited leverage. The casual cruelty sharpened by applause. Margot wasn't improvising. She was repeating something that had always worked. Across the table, a man in a charcoal tuxedo glanced again at the place cards. He frowned, then checked his phone. He wasn't laughing anymore. He was doing math. Another guest shifted in his seat, discomfort creeping in around the edges of his smile. He had laughed because everyone else had. Now he wasn't sure why. Ariana felt the shift before it fully arrived. Silence had a way of doing that, stretching time, forcing people to sit with their own behavior. She didn't rush it. She never did. Margot noticed the change and misread it. She straightened, sensing she was losing the room, and decided to reclaim it. "Let's not be awkward," she said brightly. "This is a celebration, after all." She raised her glass again, eyes flicking to Ariana. "No hard feelings." The phrase hung there, hollow. Ariana looked at the glass. At the wine trembling inside it. Then she looked back at Margot. "None at all," she said. Her tone was neutral. Not conciliatory. Not defensive. Neutrality, in rooms like this, was unsettling. It gave nothing to push against. Margot smiled, relieved. She took the words as surrender. What Ariana didn't say was that feelings had never been the currency here. She hadn't come for validation. She hadn't come to be welcomed. She had come because the invitation mattered, because what was being finalized tonight had consequences that reached far beyond this table. She glanced around the ballroom again. The chandeliers. The donors. The press pretending not to watch while recording everything. She saw how quickly attention could turn, how fragile the hierarchy really was when stripped of ceremony. Her phone vibrated once. Soft. Almost imperceptible. She didn't look at it. Across the room, the orchestra transitioned into something lighter, as if instructed by instinct. The gala wanted to move on. Moments like this were supposed to be smoothed over, forgotten, folded into the night. Margot leaned toward her assistant and whispered something sharp. The assistant nodded, already typing. Damage control. Optics. Ariana recognized the choreography. A waiter approached with a practiced smile. Another glass, he asked Ariana, eyes flicking nervously between the two women. No, thank you, Ariana said. The waiter hesitated, then retreated. Margot watched this with faint irritation. She didn't like unanswered questions. She liked reactions, gratitude, embarrassment, anger. Ariana was giving her none of them. Enjoy the evening, Margot said finally, dismissive now. It only gets better from here. Ariana inclined her head once. Polite. Complete. Inside, the calculation had already finished. She placed her napkin neatly on the table. She adjusted her chair by a fraction of an inch. Small movements. Invisible to most. But deliberate. Around her, conversations resumed. Laughter tried to find its rhythm again. The room believed the moment had passed. It hadn't. It had only been labeled incorrectly. They thought her silence meant she was out of place. They didn't yet understand that silence, for Ariana Cole, was simply the space where decisions were made. To everyone in the room, Ariana Cole was still an unanswered question. That was not an accident. For nearly 2 decades, she had built her life that way, quiet, compartmentalized, invisible to the kind of people who confused publicity with power. She didn't sit on panels. She didn't chase magazine covers. She didn't trade influence for applause. The fewer people who knew her face, the more freely she moved. And tonight, that anonymity had done exactly what it always did. It exposed the truth. Ariana's gaze drifted across the ballroom again, not with curiosity now, but with recognition. She knew this ecosystem intimately, the rituals, the egos, the subtle hierarchies enforced with smiles and seating charts. She had financed rooms like this. Owned buildings like this. Decided which names stayed engraved on donor walls and which quietly disappeared. What no one here understood was that this gala was not just a party. It was a deadline. For the past 11 months, negotiations had been unfolding behind layers of legal distance and deliberate opacity. Calls routed through partners. Documents handled by firms whose discretion was legendary. Every signature delayed, every meeting postponed. Ariana had insisted on it. She always did. The deal on the table, though no one at this dinner table knew it yet, was worth $4.9 billion. Not a round number. Not symbolic. Precise. Calculated to the decimal. It was also the only thing standing between Margot Hale's company and a very public collapse. Margot's firm had been bleeding quietly for years, overextended acquisitions, cosmetic growth, balance sheets propped up by confidence instead of capital. The market hadn't noticed yet. The press certainly hadn't. But Ariana had. She noticed everything. The merger being finalized tonight would change that trajectory overnight. It would stabilize Margot's company, restore investor faith, and cement Margot's position as one of the most powerful women in her industry. The announcement was scheduled for tomorrow morning. Press releases drafted. champagne already chilling for a second round of celebration. All of it hinged on a single authorization: Ariana's. Margot had never seen her. In her mind, the financier behind the deal was an abstract, some distant fund, some committee, some faceless executive who would never sit at a table like this. Certainly not someone in a burnt orange dress who didn't signal status loudly enough. Ariana let that assumption live. She remembered the beginning, not the gala lights or the tailored suits, but the quiet office where she'd signed her first loan papers, hands steady even as the man across the desk refused to meet her eyes. She remembered being underestimated as a feature, not a bug. How useful it had been. Around the table, the laughter had settled into a dull hum. Margot was already talking to someone else, recounting the moment as a harmless joke, rewriting it in real time. Ariana watched the narrative form and smiled inwardly. Stories could be edited. So could outcomes. Her phone vibrated again. This time, she glanced down. One line of text. No emojis. No explanations. Ready when you are. She locked the screen and slipped the phone back beside her plate. Across the room, a man she recognized, one of Margot's largest private backers, was staring at her openly now. He wasn't smiling. He was searching memory, pulling at threads. Something about her posture. Her stillness. The way staff unconsciously deferred. He didn't have it yet. But he would. Ariana folded her hands together, resting them lightly on the table. She felt no rush. Power didn't need to announce itself. It only needed to arrive on time. The orchestra swelled. The night pushed forward. Toasts were being planned. Futures spoken about as if they were already secure. Ariana Cole sat quietly among them, the only person in the room who knew that the most important decision of the evening had already been made. And that it would cost someone everything. The gala pressed forward as if nothing had happened. That was the illusion. Rooms like this depended on the belief that momentum could erase discomfort. Conversations restarted. Laughter found a safer volume. Glasses were refilled. The orchestra leaned into something upbeat, coaxing the room back into its familiar rhythm. Margot Hale was already in her element again. She stood now, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, greeting a late-arriving donor with theatrical warmth. Her voice carried just far enough to remind the table who controlled the tone of the evening. She laughed easily, confidently, certain the moment with Ariana had been resolved in her favor. Ariana watched without expression. She noticed the details others missed. The way Margot's assistant hovered closer than before. The quick glance Margot cast toward the press table, checking angles. The subtle tightening around her eyes when she laughed. Power, when threatened, always revealed itself in microfractures. Ariana's phone vibrated again. She didn't pick it up immediately. She let the vibration pass, feeling the quiet satisfaction of knowing the clock was no longer in the room's control. Timing, she had learned, was not about speed. It was about inevitability. Across the table, the man in the charcoal tuxedo leaned toward another guest. "Do you know who she is?" he murmured, nodding almost imperceptibly in Ariana's direction. The other man shook his head. "No. But she doesn't act like she needs to." That was enough to plant the doubt. Ariana finally lifted her phone, shielding the screen with her palm. She read quickly. Precise language. Legal language. The kind that left no room for interpretation. She typed 3 words in response. Proceed. Effective immediately. She didn't watch the message send. Instead, she placed the phone face down again and turned her attention back to the room. Margot raised her glass for another toast, unaware that the axis beneath her had already shifted. To partnerships, she said brightly. To vision. And to women who know how to lead. Applause followed. Loud. Polished. Empty. Ariana joined in, tapping her fingers together once. Not clapping. Acknowledging. Somewhere beyond the ballroom, far from chandeliers and champagne, systems began to move. Notifications triggered. Authorizations were rescinded. Capital rerouted with the quiet efficiency of machines that did not care about reputation. At the table, a donor's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowned, and slipped it back into his pocket. Another guest checked hers more openly, brows knitting together before she forced a smile and returned to her conversation. Margot noticed the first ripple and dismissed it. She was used to being the center of attention. She assumed every glance, every pause, still revolved around her. That assumption had protected her for years. It wouldn't tonight. Ariana shifted in her seat, crossing one leg over the other. She felt no triumph. No anticipation. Only clarity. This was not retaliation. It was alignment. Margot leaned toward a board member, her voice low now. Something's off, she said, the confidence thinning. The man nodded, already pulling out his phone. A pause settled over their corner of the table. Not silence, something heavier. The kind that made people check screens instead of faces. Ariana took a sip of water. Calm. Unhurried. She had been underestimated before. Many times. But never by someone whose entire future rested on her consent. Around them, the gala continued its performance. Smiles held a fraction too long. Laughter arrived a second too late. The orchestra played on, oblivious. Margot's assistant returned, whispering urgently now. Margot's smile froze mid-gesture. Not now, she hissed, still facing the room. The assistant didn't move. Ariana observed this with detached interest. She knew what came next, not the words, but the feeling. The moment when confidence curdled into disbelief. She placed her napkin neatly on the table and folded her hands again. The decision had been made. The consequences were already in motion. And for the first time that evening, the room was no longer laughing at her. It was beginning to listen. It didn't announce itself. There was no dramatic interruption, no raised voice cutting through the music. The orchestra kept playing. Champagne kept flowing. The chandeliers continued to glow as if nothing in the room had changed. But something had. Margot Hale felt it before she understood it. Her assistant stood too close now, posture rigid, eyes no longer scanning the room but fixed on the small screen in her hand. Margot turned slightly, still smiling at a donor, still performing. Later, she whispered through her teeth. The assistant didn't move. Margot's smile tightened. She excused herself with a practiced laugh and leaned in. "What is it?" she murmured. The assistant swallowed. "We've lost confirmation." Margot blinked. "Lost what?" "Final authorization," the assistant said quietly. "It's been withdrawn." For half a second, Margot didn't react. The word slid past her without landing. Withdrawn was not a word that belonged in tonight's vocabulary. Everything had been settled. Everything had been agreed to. This was ceremony now, not negotiation. "Run that again," Margot said, her voice still light, still public-facing. The assistant turned the phone so only Margot could see. Margot's eyes dropped to the screen. Then froze. Across the table, Ariana Cole noticed the exact moment Margot's confidence fractured. It was subtle. A pause that lasted a beat too long. A breath taken and not released. The hand gripping the stem of the glass just a little tighter. Margot straightened abruptly, scanning the room as if answers might be written on the walls. Her gaze landed on Ariana without realizing it had done so. Ariana met it calmly. She didn't smile. Margot's phone buzzed in her own hand now, once, then again. She glanced down, frowning, then quickly locked the screen and slipped it into her clutch. "Excuse me," she said to the donors around her. "I need a moment." She stepped away from the table, heels sharp against marble, assistant in tow. A ripple moved through the guests nearest them. Someone noticed. Someone always did. "What's going on?" a man asked quietly. "Probably nothing," his wife replied, though she didn't sound convinced. Ariana shifted her chair back slightly, creating space. Not to leave. Just enough to breathe. She watched Margot speak urgently to two board members near the edge of the ballroom. Watched their expressions change in sequence: confusion, disbelief, calculation. One of them pulled out his phone. Another shook his head slowly. The music faltered for a fraction of a second before correcting itself. Phones began to light up around the room like distant stars. A donor glanced at a notification and frowned. Another turned his screen away too late. Ariana caught a glimpse of a headline draft, nothing published yet, but close enough to taste. "Is this a joke?" Margot hissed, no longer caring who heard. "This doesn't just disappear." One of the board members looked at her, pale. "It didn't disappear," he said. "It was pulled." Margot's breath hitched. "By who?" The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. At the table, Ariana lifted her water glass and took a small sip. Her pulse was steady. This part was never loud. It never needed to be. Margot turned back toward the center of the room, eyes searching, landing again on Ariana. This time, the look held recognition. Not familiarity, fear. The dawning understanding that she had misjudged the room, the night, the woman she had laughed at. She took a step toward the table, then stopped herself, glancing at the cameras, the donors, the carefully curated image still hanging by a thread. Ariana stood. The movement was quiet, deliberate. Chairs scraped softly nearby as people noticed without meaning to. Conversation stalled mid-sentence. Ariana gathered her clutch and placed her napkin on the table. She looked at Margot, then past her, addressing the space rather than the person. "I think that concludes my evening," she said. Her voice carried, not because it was loud, but because the room had gone still enough to hear it. Margot opened her mouth. Closed it. "You can't just," she started, then stopped, catching herself. Too many eyes. Too much at stake. Ariana inclined her head once. Polite. Final. As she turned away, the truth settled over the ballroom like a shadow passing over light. The deal wasn't delayed. It wasn't renegotiated. It was gone. And every person in the room could feel it, even if they didn't yet understand what it would cost them. Ariana Cole walked toward the exit without looking back, leaving behind a gala that had just become a reckoning. The first sound wasn't shouting. It was silence. Ariana Cole's footsteps faded toward the exit, and with them went the illusion that this evening was still under control. The orchestra slowed, uncertain, like musicians sensing a conductor had vanished. Conversations collapsed into fragments. No one quite knew where to look. Margot Hale stood frozen near the center of the ballroom, her back perfectly straight, her expression still arranged into something that resembled composure. It took effort now. Too much effort. Her phone vibrated again. She didn't want to look at it. She already knew what it would say. Around her, donors were checking their screens openly now. No pretense. No discretion. The blue light reflected off crystal and gold, turning the room cold. "What does this mean?" someone whispered. "I'm seeing the same thing," another replied. "That can't be right." A man near the bar let out a short, disbelieving laugh. 4.9, he said under his breath. "That's not a delay. That's a death sentence." Margot turned sharply toward the sound, her gaze sharp enough to cut. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, too loudly. "There's been an error." No one answered her. They were all too busy recalculating. At the table Ariana had left, a woman in pearls leaned toward her husband. "Who was she?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know. But I know what just happened." The press had noticed by now. Cameras shifted. Lenses zoomed, not toward Margot's smile, but toward her hands, one clenched, one shaking slightly as she tried to steady herself. A producer whispered urgently into a headset. Margot's assistant returned, face pale. "The confirmation is official," she said under her breath. "They've notified legal. The release is being revised." Margot closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. "Pull the press," she snapped. "All of it." The assistant hesitated. "It's already circulating." That was when Margot understood. This wasn't a private problem. This was public. The room, which had laughed so easily minutes ago, was now watching her with something close to curiosity. Not sympathy. Assessment. The same kind Ariana had shown earlier. Margot scanned the crowd for allies and found none willing to meet her eyes. People turned away, suddenly busy with drinks, with conversations that no longer included her. Proximity had become liability. She took a breath and stepped forward, raising her glass again. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice strained but controlled, "a small adjustment to the evening." A murmur rolled through the room. Someone laughed, sharp and humorless. "Adjustment," a voice muttered. Margot faltered. "Just for a moment." That was enough. Across the ballroom, a financier she'd relied on for years leaned back and crossed his arms. Another donor whispered to an aide, already planning distance. Deals were being reconsidered in real time. Invitations mentally revoked. Ariana's absence was louder than any speech. Margot felt it like pressure on her chest. She remembered the look Ariana had given her, not anger, not triumph. Certainty. The kind that came from knowing outcomes before they happened. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she looked. The message was brief. Clinical. Termination confirmed. Funds reallocated. Margot's grip tightened around the phone until her knuckles whitened. At the edge of the room, a waiter dropped a tray. The crash echoed, drawing every eye. No one laughed this time. The gala had turned. What had been a stage for Margot's authority was now a mirror reflecting her vulnerability. The hierarchy had inverted without ceremony, without permission. Outside, beyond the ballroom doors, Ariana Cole stepped into the night air, the city lights sharp and clear. She didn't slow. She didn't check her phone. Behind her, inside the gilded room, the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. And the people who had laughed were learning, all at once, what it meant to be on the wrong side of silence. The room didn't erupt. It recoiled. What followed Ariana Cole's exit wasn't chaos but something colder, a collective withdrawal. Conversations died mid-sentence. Smiles vanished without ceremony. The gala, once choreographed down to the second, had lost its rhythm. Margot Hale felt it instantly. She stood alone in the center of a widening circle of space, as if the air itself were backing away from her. People weren't staring anymore. They were avoiding. The donors who had crowded her moments earlier now found reasons to step aside, to check messages, to suddenly remember other obligations. Her name, once spoken with admiration, was now being handled carefully. Quietly. She pulled it, someone whispered near the bar. Completely, another asked. Every cent. The words traveled faster than the orchestra ever could. Margot turned toward a cluster of investors, forcing her shoulders back, forcing her voice steady. Let's be clear, she said, projecting confidence that no longer felt natural. This is temporary. A misunderstanding. No one challenged her. That was worse. A man she had known for years met her eyes briefly, then looked away. Another nodded politely and excused himself, already moving toward the exit. An aide leaned close to Margot's ear and whispered, "The board is asking for an emergency call. Now." Margot didn't answer. She was watching the press. Cameras had repositioned. Not aggressively, professionally. They were no longer capturing celebration. They were documenting aftermath. Every flicker of her expression, every misstep, was being recorded with clinical interest. She lifted her glass again, hand trembling just enough to notice. "Please," she said, voice thin, "let's not jump to conclusions." A laugh cut through the room. Short. Unkind. Conclusions were signed, someone said. Margot's jaw tightened. She felt the floor tilt beneath her, the familiar sensation of certainty slipping away. She searched the room for anyone who would anchor her. Someone who still needed her. She found none. The gala staff had begun adjusting too. Waiters redirected trays away from her. An event coordinator murmured instructions into a headset, eyes darting between Margot and the exits. The night was being quietly rewritten. Margot's phone rang. She answered it this time, turning away from the crowd. "What?" she hissed. Her face drained of color as she listened. Her free hand pressed against the table to steady herself. When she hung up, the glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. No one rushed to help. The sound echoed, sharp, final. Margot looked up, eyes scanning the room in disbelief. This couldn't be happening like this. Not here. Not in front of everyone. But it was. Because Ariana Cole hadn't raised her voice. Hadn't defended herself. Hadn't asked for respect. She had simply removed consent. And without it, Margot's authority had nothing to stand on. Across the ballroom, a donor leaned toward another and said quietly, "I think we just witnessed the end of something." The other nodded. Yes. And the beginning of someone else. Margot stood amid the wreckage of an evening she had believed she controlled, realizing too late that power didn't belong to the loudest person in the room. It belonged to the one who could walk away and let the room collapse behind her. By morning, the gala was no longer a memory. It was a headline. Financial feeds lit up before sunrise, their language stripped of elegance and mercy. Merger terminated. Funds withdrawn. Confidence shaken. Analysts spoke in measured tones while numbers did the screaming for them. Margot Hale's company opened the day in freefall. Shares dipped, then slid, then fell hard enough to trigger automated halts. Trading desks lit up with urgent calls. Banks asked questions they had postponed for years. Partners who had once begged for proximity suddenly wanted distance. No one mentioned the gala. They didn't need to. Inside executive offices miles away from chandeliers and champagne, the consequences arrived with precision. Credit lines tightened. Legal teams scrambled. Emergency board meetings were scheduled before breakfast. The merger that was supposed to save everything was now being dissected as a cautionary tale. How had it unraveled so quickly? The answer moved quietly through private channels, never fully spoken but widely understood. Ariana Cole had withdrawn. Not paused. Not delayed. Withdrawn. For those who knew her work, that said everything. She had a reputation, one built not on visibility but on finality. When Ariana stepped away, she didn't circle back. She didn't negotiate through headlines. She moved forward and expected the world to keep up. By noon, investors had begun revising their forecasts. Commentators used words like miscalculation and overconfidence. One analyst, off record, said simply, they forgot who they were dealing with. Margot sat in a glass-walled conference room, untouched coffee growing cold in front of her. The night before replayed in fragments, the laughter, the pointed finger, the woman in orange who hadn't reacted the way she was supposed to. She understood it now. That woman hadn't needed to win the room. She had already owned the outcome. Across the city, Ariana moved through her day as she always did. Quietly. Efficiently. Meetings held. Decisions confirmed. Capital redirected toward projects that aligned with her values, companies that didn't confuse power with entitlement. She didn't read the opinion pieces. She didn't need to. Her team handled the fallout with practiced calm. Statements released. Numbers clarified. No commentary offered beyond what was necessary. Ariana's name appeared in print without her photo beside it, as it usually did. That anonymity, once again, proved useful. By evening, the narrative had settled into something colder and more accurate. This hadn't been a scandal. It hadn't been revenge. It had been a correction. Margot Hale's empire hadn't fallen because of a market shift or an external threat. It had collapsed under the weight of a single assumption that respect was optional and power was performative. In the end, no one remembered the joke that started it. They remembered the silence that followed. And the woman who left the room carrying nothing but her dignity while everything else disappeared behind her. The story didn't end with applause. There was no stage left for that. Weeks later, the ballroom existed only in memory, a polished room that had revealed more than it intended. The chandeliers still hung. The marble still gleamed. But the certainty that once filled that space had not returned. Margot Hale retreated from the spotlight she once commanded. Her name appeared less often, and when it did, it was framed carefully, cautiously. Power, once assumed permanent, had learned the cost of being careless. Ariana Cole never commented. She didn't grant interviews or issue reflections. She didn't need to correct the record. The record had already corrected itself. Instead, she moved forward, investing in companies that valued competence over pedigree, restraint over spectacle. She expanded quietly, her influence felt more than seen. The kind of power that didn't announce itself because it didn't have to. For those who had been in the room that night, the lesson lingered. They remembered how quickly laughter could turn into distance. How easily confidence could evaporate when it was built on assumption instead of respect. And how silence, in the right hands, could become the most decisive force of all. Ariana's name was spoken differently after that. Softer. With care. Not out of fear, but understanding. Because dignity had never been a performance. And justice had never required a voice raised in anger. It only required someone willing to stand still, make a decision, and let the consequences speak. And in that quiet, the truth became unmistakable. Power doesn't need permission. It only needs character.